Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little unusual. Instead of discussing how you would almost certainly perish in a Roman mine, a galley ship, or an enthusiastic but poorly supervised gladiator arena, we're going to explore the opposite. We're going to look at the rare, almost suspiciously comfortable corners of the Roman job market. The positions where you might, just might, finish the week with your spine intact and your dignity mostly uncrushed. And if this kind of slow, mildly reassuring tour through ancient employment helps you drift off, remember to quietly subscribe. Rome had many problems, but it also had paperwork. And wherever there is paperwork, there is opportunity. Now, when most people think of work in ancient Rome, they imagine slaves pushing millstones or soldiers standing in the rain on the edge of the empire, wondering why Britain exists. And yes, those jobs were plentiful. But Rome was not just an empire of conquest. It was an empire of administration, bureaucracy, lists, seals, wax tablets, endless columns of numbers written by men who had very strong opinions about ink consistency. And that is where our first surprisingly tolerable job appears, the scribe. Being a Roman scribe was, in many ways, the ancient equivalent of having a stable office job. You sat down, indoors, with a roof, often in the shade. You copied legal documents, recorded tax payments, drafted letters for wealthy citizens who preferred not to strain themselves with literacy. Literacy, by the way, was not universal, which meant if you could read and write, you possessed what we might gently call a market advantage. Instead of hauling stone, you hauled sentences. Instead of blistered hands, you developed mild finger cramps, which, as far as ancient injuries go, is almost luxurious, and scribes were needed everywhere, in courts, in military camps, in senatorial offices, even in private households. A wealthy Roman family might employ a personal secretary to manage correspondence and accounts. Imagine that. Your main occupational hazard being boredom. Occasionally ink stains, possibly listening to your employer complain about grain prices. But compared to rowing a warship across the Mediterranean, this was practically a spa retreat. Speaking of spas, we should talk about bath attendants. The Roman baths were not merely places to get clean. They were social hubs, political networking centers, the ancient equivalent of a gym, a cafe, and a gossip forum combined into one large, steamy building. Working in a bathhouse could mean managing towels, maintaining fires for the heated floors, or assisting patrons as they moved between hot, warm, and cold rooms. Yes, it was physical work, but it was steady, indoors, and crucially, it did not involve being stabbed. Some bath attendants even specialized in massage and oil application, which meant their workday consisted of carefully scraping oil off relaxed citizens with a curved tool called a strigil. It is not glamorous, but it is significantly better than being that citizen's farm laborer. Then there were bakers. Now, before you imagine this as a gentle sunrise activity with soft music and flour drifting poetically through golden light, remember that Roman bakeries were hot and demanding. However, bread was essential. Rome was fed daily through enormous grain distributions. This meant bakers had stable demand. In some cases, even legal protections to ensure the city's bread supply remained uninterrupted. Stability in ancient times was rare. If you baked bread in Rome, you were unlikely to be replaced by a barbarian invasion overnight. The empire might wobble, but people still needed breakfast, and if you were particularly fortunate, you might find yourself as an engineer. Roman engineers were respected professionals responsible for roads, aqueducts, bridges, and military fortifications. These were skilled roles, technical roles. If you understood geometry and construction, you could oversee projects that lasted centuries. Literally, centuries. Imagine building something that still stands 2,000 years later, all without answering a single email. Of course, none of these jobs were perfect. Rome had hierarchy. Status mattered. Wealth mattered more. And for every comfortable scribe, there were dozens of exhausted laborers. But what's quietly fascinating is that even in a world of sandals and senators, there were niches of relative comfort, roles where skill replaced brute strength, where literacy replaced muscle, where the worst part of your day might be correcting someone's terrible dictation. So if you ever find yourself imagining life in ancient Rome, do not picture only the arena. Picture instead a shaded office, a wax tablet, and the soft scratch of a stylus. The empire was loud, violent, ambitious, but somewhere inside it, someone was carefully balancing accounts and doing quite well, all things considered. And that, strangely enough, might have been the best job of all. If you were especially fortunate, and by fortunate I mean born into the correct household with the correct connections and the correct ability to look serious while holding a scroll, you might have found yourself working not just as a scribe, but as a legal assistant or advocate in the Roman courts. Now, Roman law was not a casual hobby. It was an obsession. The Romans adored structure, they adored categories, they adored arguing about property boundaries with the emotional intensity of a modern sports rivalry. Working in law did not necessarily mean you were a grand orator like Cicero. In fact, most legal workers were quieter figures. They drafted documents, prepared cases, organized testimonies, and made sure the correct wax seals were applied to the correct parchment. It was meticulous work, calm work, indoor work. You would spend your days surrounded by scrolls instead of livestock, which, depending on your preference for smell, was an upgrade. And then there was the life of a Roman teacher. Now, before you picture cheerful children politely raising their hands, let us adjust expectations slightly. Roman education could be strict, very strict. But if you were educated enough to teach grammar, rhetoric, or mathematics, you were occupying a respected intellectual space. You worked with the sons, occasionally daughters, of citizens who valued education. Your tools were texts, not tools of war. Your primary hazard was frustration, not impalement. Teachers of rhetoric especially could achieve modest fame. Rhetoric was the pathway to politics. If you shaped a future senator's speaking skills, you indirectly shaped the empire's direction. Not bad for someone whose daily routine involved correcting Latin declensions. And while pay varied, skilled educators could secure patronage from wealthy families. Patronage in Rome was like a long-term subscription model. A wealthy sponsor supported you financially in exchange for loyalty and services. Stability, again, quietly invaluable. Now let us consider something unexpectedly comfortable, being a merchant with a permanent shop in a busy Roman city. Not a wandering trader braving storms at sea, but a settled shopkeeper selling textiles, pottery, spices, or tools. Roman cities were vibrant marketplaces, streets lined with tabernae, small storefronts open to pedestrian traffic. If you owned or managed one, your days were predictable. You opened shutters, arranged goods, haggled politely, closed at dusk. Yes, there were taxes, there were fluctuations in supply, but urban commerce in Rome was remarkably sophisticated. There were trade networks stretching from Britain to Egypt. If you positioned yourself well, you could participate in this enormous economic web without ever picking up a sword. You might even grow wealthy enough to invest in property, which in Rome was the ancient equivalent of quietly winning the long game. Another surprisingly desirable role was that of a physician. Roman medicine was not exactly modern. There were theories about bodily humors. There were alarming surgical instruments. But trained physicians, especially those educated in Greek medical traditions, were valued professionals. Wealthy households employed private doctors. Cities needed practitioners. If you were competent and careful, your skills granted you mobility and status. Of course, medicine involved risk. But it was intellectual risk, diagnostic risk, not the risk of collapsing scaffolding or collapsing empires. And interestingly, many physicians in Rome were former slaves who gained freedom and built respected careers. Rome, for all its rigidity, did occasionally allow upward movement through expertise. We should also mention the role of a state manager. Large Roman villas required oversight. Crops had to be rotated, accounts balanced, workers supervised. The estate manager, often a trusted freedman or educated slave, acted as the operational backbone of agricultural wealth. It was responsibility heavy, yes, but it was structured, administrative, strategic. You were thinking about yields and logistics rather than digging trenches yourself. And then there were civil service roles within the imperial bureaucracy. As the empire expanded, administration became essential. Census records, tax registries, infrastructure planning, someone had to track it all. And those someones were not standing in front lines. They were seated at desks. Rome's greatest strength was not just its legions, it was its paperwork. So when we gently peel away the dramatic imagery of gladiators and marching armies, we find something almost familiar. A world of offices, shops, schools, clinics, ledgers, contracts, quiet negotiations over olive oil prices. It is strangely comforting. The ancient world, for all its chaos, also contained ordinary professionals doing ordinary tasks. If you chose wisely, or were chosen wisely by circumstance, you could build a life that was stable, even respectable. You might complain about clients, about students, about grain shipments delayed by storms. But you would go home at night, eat bread you did not have to harvest yourself, sleep without armor. And in ancient Rome, that was already a remarkable career achievement. There was also something quietly enviable about being an architect in ancient Rome. Not the kind who personally hauled stone blocks up scaffolding, but the kind who stood at a moderate distance, holding measuring rods and discussing proportions in a thoughtful tone. Roman architecture was not accidental, it was calculated. Roads were straight on purpose. Aqueducts were angled with mathematical precision. Amphitheaters were designed so that even someone in the back row could see a man losing a disagreement with a lion. If you were trained in design and mathematics, you could oversee projects that required both imagination and restraint. You worked with geometry, not just gravity, and while construction sites were noisy and dusty, the architect's role was supervisory. You were consulted, respected, possibly even slightly envied. There is something satisfying about pointing at a blueprint and saying, yes, the arch should go there, and having hundreds of workers nod and make it happen. Closely related to this was the profession of surveyor. Roman land surveyors, known as agrimensores, were essential to the empire's expansion. They measured newly conquered territories, divided land into neat grids, and resolved disputes over boundaries. If two farmers argued over a strip of soil, the surveyor arrived with tools, calculations, and the authority to settle the matter. It may sound modest, but in a world where land equaled wealth, being the person who defined property lines was quietly powerful. Your weapon was a measuring instrument. Your battlefield was a field, and your victories were lines drawn with mathematical calm. Another surprisingly tolerable role was that of a librarian or archivist, particularly in larger cities like Rome or Alexandria. Yes, Alexandria was technically outside Rome's early boundaries, but it fell under Roman control and remained a major intellectual hub. Libraries were not simply rooms of dusty scrolls. They were centers of scholarship. If you managed texts, organized knowledge, and assisted scholars, your daily environment was one of relative quiet. You handled ideas instead of livestock. You worried about scroll preservation instead of sword maintenance. Granted, fire was a risk, but that was a general risk in ancient cities. On a typical day, your greatest challenge might be locating the correct scroll of Homer without mixing it up with something equally epic, but slightly less requested. And then there was the role of personal secretary to a senator or wealthy official. Now, this required tact, discretion, a calm expression when overhearing politically inconvenient conversations. But it also meant proximity to influence. You drafted speeches, managed appointments, organized correspondence. In many ways, you were the steady, unseen hand behind someone else's public authority. The job required literacy, organizational skill, and the ability to stay composed while senators debated grain subsidies with dramatic seriousness. But it was indoors, structured, and relatively safe from physical danger. The most intense part of your day might be finding a misplaced document 5 minutes before a public address. Let us not forget the role of skilled artisan. While unskilled labor was exhausting, artisans, those who specialized in metalwork, sculpture, mosaic design, or fine pottery, could achieve respectable standing. Rome appreciated craftsmanship. Wealthy citizens commissioned decorative mosaics for their villas. Public buildings required statues and inscriptions. Skilled artisans often operated workshops, training apprentices, and maintaining steady business. It was creative work. Physical, yes, but skilled. The difference between swinging a hammer randomly and shaping bronze with precision is the difference between survival and reputation. And reputation in Rome could translate into patronage. A well-known artisan might receive consistent commissions, allowing for financial stability that farm labor rarely offered. Even within the military, there were roles that were far more comfortable than standing at the empire's edge in the rain. Administrative officers, engineers attached to legions, quartermasters responsible for logistics. These were essential, but less glamorous positions. Someone had to manage supplies. Someone had to track rations. Someone had to ensure that sandals reached soldiers before blisters did. If you were part of that logistical backbone, your life involved organization rather than direct combat. Rome's military success depended heavily on planning, and planning, once again, meant paperwork, lists, inventories, schedules. The empire functioned because someone, somewhere, was counting things carefully, and perhaps that is the quiet theme running through all of these desirable roles. Skill, structure, stability. In a civilization often remembered for spectacle and conquest, the most comfortable lives were built not on brute force, but on competence. Literacy, mathematics, craftsmanship, medicine, administration. These were the gentle ladders that lifted individuals above the most punishing forms of labor. So if you imagine yourself drifting back 2,000 years, sandals slightly dusty, tunic reasonably clean, you might choose the stylus over the sword, the ledger over the legion, the workshop over the quarry. And if you chose carefully, ancient Rome might not have been such a terrible place to clock in each morning. There was also a certain quiet satisfaction in being a Roman banker. Yes, ancient Rome had bankers. They were called argentarii, and they operated from small tables in forums, markets, and commercial districts. Their entire profession revolved around counting coins, exchanging currency, and managing deposits. It may not sound thrilling. It was not. But that is precisely the point. While soldiers marched and senators shouted, the banker sat. He weighed silver, verified authenticity, recorded transactions on wax tablets. Rome's economy was complex. Trade stretched across continents. People needed loans, credit, and secure storage for their money. If you were competent with numbers and careful with records, you could build a stable livelihood without ever lifting a shield. There was risk, of course, economic downturns, political upheaval, the occasional debtor with creative interpretations of repayment schedules. But compared to quarry work or galley rowing, calculating interest rates was practically meditative. Closely connected to finance was the role of tax administrator. Now, tax collection in Rome had a somewhat notorious reputation. Publicani, private contractors who collected taxes, were often disliked. But within the administrative apparatus, there were structured positions responsible for record-keeping and assessment. These roles involved oversight rather than direct confrontation. You reviewed accounts. You processed payments. You maintained registries. It required organization and attention to detail. It did not require wrestling anyone into compliance personally. If you worked in the bureaucratic layer instead of the front-facing collection role, your daily routine was predictable. A desk, documents, columns of figures, perhaps the soft murmur of other clerks debating grain tariffs. Another surprisingly decent occupation was that of a courier within the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system. This network allowed official messages to travel across vast distances with impressive efficiency. Couriers rode between relay stations carrying sealed documents. Now, yes, this involved travel. And travel in the ancient world could be uncomfortable. But official couriers had access to fresh horses and designated rest points. They were part of a respected system, not wandering aimlessly. If you enjoyed movement and purpose without being permanently stationed in a freezing frontier camp, this role offered structured mobility. There is something almost poetic about imagining a Roman courier riding across well-built roads at dawn, delivering messages that quietly shaped imperial decisions. No battlefield chaos. Just distance, responsibility, and the rhythm of hooves. We should also consider the role of entertainer, though not the gladiatorial kind. Actors, musicians, and performers occupied an unusual social space. Their status could be ambiguous, but successful performers could gain popularity and patronage. Public festivals required entertainment. Wealthy households hosted private gatherings. If you had talent in music or theater, you could convert skill into income. It required charisma and resilience, certainly, but it did not require mining salt underground. In Rome, even leisure had structure, and structured leisure meant structured employment. Then there were household stewards in wealthy Roman homes. Large urban houses and rural villas operated like small organizations. Supplies had to be managed, staff supervised, guests received. A steward handled logistics and ensured daily operations ran smoothly. It was a managerial role, demanding in responsibility, yes, but less physically punishing than agricultural labor. You coordinated rather than carried, organized rather than harvested. In many cases, experienced stewards could become indispensable to their households, which translated into security. Perhaps one of the most quietly comfortable roles, however, was that of philosopher or tutor under patronage. Rome admired Greek philosophy deeply. Educated elites sought private tutors to teach Stoicism, rhetoric, or literature. If you possessed knowledge and the ability to explain it calmly, you could secure long-term support from a wealthy family. Imagine spending your days discussing ethics and virtue while reclining in shaded courtyards. Your greatest challenge being whether your pupil preferred Epictetus or Seneca. Compared to digging irrigation ditches, this was almost luxurious intellectual labor. And through all of these roles, one theme remained steady. The best jobs in ancient Rome were rarely glamorous. They were not the ones immortalized in marble statues. They were not performed in arenas under roaring crowds. They were administrative, skilled, structured. They required literacy, numeracy, or craft. They rewarded patience over aggression. They allowed a person to remain indoors more often than not. In an empire that conquered continents, the most comfortable lives were built quietly, at desks, in workshops, along library shelves, or behind counting tables. Rome's spectacle drew attention, but Rome's stability depended on individuals doing calm, repetitive, unremarkable tasks exceptionally well. And if you had managed to land one of those roles, ancient Rome might have felt less like a battlefield and more like a very large, very dusty office. If you zoom out a little further, beyond the marble columns and the dramatic speeches, you begin to notice something almost disappointingly modern about the Roman world. It functioned because people showed up to work, quietly, repeatedly, with moderate competence. And if you managed to place yourself in the right corner of that system, life could be surprisingly stable. Take the role of a notary. Notaries in Rome were responsible for officially recording agreements, contracts, and legal transactions. Marriage contracts, property sales, business partnerships. They ensured that the right words were written down in the right order, witnessed properly, and archived. It sounds almost aggressively uneventful, which, again, is exactly why it was good. You spent your day documenting other people's decisions rather than making life-threatening ones yourself. You developed a reputation for reliability. People sought you out when something important needed to be formalized. And in a society that cared deeply about law and order, at least on paper, being the person who made things official carried a quiet authority. Then there were accountants. Yes, Rome had those too. Large estates, military units, public building projects, and commercial enterprises all required someone to track expenditures and income. Grain shipments, wages, material costs, none of it simply floated in the air. It had to be recorded. An accountant's tools were stylus and tablet. Their battlefield was a ledger. Their enemies were arithmetic mistakes. And while that may not inspire epic poetry, it did inspire stability. When you are the person who understands where the money is going, you become difficult to replace. Even within agriculture, the backbone of the Roman economy, there were tiers of comfort. Small independent farmers worked hard, yes, but those who owned moderate plots and managed them efficiently could achieve a modest but secure life. Owning land in Rome meant voting rights, status, and long-term resilience. You were not at the mercy of a daily wage. You were tied to something enduring. Now, this was not effortless. Farming required dawn wake-ups and weather anxieties. But compared to being a landless laborer, ownership changed everything. Stability, once again, was the quiet luxury of the ancient world. Let's not overlook skilled translators and interpreters either. As Rome expanded, it encountered countless languages and cultures. Administrators and military commanders needed intermediaries. If you were bilingual, say fluent in Latin and Greek, or Latin and a provincial language, you possessed an incredibly valuable skill. Instead of fighting on the frontier, you negotiated, clarified treaties, assisted in trade agreements. You moved between worlds rather than clashing against them. It required intelligence, diplomacy, and composure. But it was strategic work, not backbreaking labor. And perhaps most understated of all were the urban craftsmen who mastered a niche and stayed there. Bookbinders, lamp makers, tailors specializing in fine tunics for elites. Rome was a city of consumption. Citizens wanted goods, repairs, customization. If you carved out a small, steady demand for your expertise, you could build a client base that returned again and again. It was not glamorous. No triumphal parade awaited the man who repaired sandals particularly well, but he might sleep comfortably knowing that people needed sandals tomorrow too. All of this paints a picture that feels oddly reassuring. Ancient Rome was dangerous. It was unequal. It was often brutal. But it was also layered, complex, full of economic niches and professional ladders. The best jobs were not defined by fame. They were defined by insulation. Insulation from physical danger, insulation from unpredictable income, insulation from the most punishing forms of labor. If you could read, if you could calculate, if you could build with precision, if you could manage, teach, heal, negotiate, or organize, you had options. Limited options, yes, but real ones. So the next time someone romanticizes life as a gladiator or a legionary, you might gently imagine yourself instead behind a wooden desk in a shaded atrium, stylus in hand, ledger open, bread already baked by someone else, the empire humming around you, and in that quiet corner of ancient Rome, you might not only survive, you might actually prefer it. And if we linger just a little longer in this enormous echoing empire, we begin to see that Rome did not simply reward strength. It rewarded specialization. And specialization, in a world where most people performed exhausting manual labor, was almost a form of luxury. Consider the role of a map maker. As Rome expanded, so did its need to understand what exactly it had acquired. Roads had to be charted, provinces outlined, distances calculated. Military campaigns required geographic awareness that went beyond walk until you see something unfamiliar. A skilled cartographer translated landscapes into information. You worked with ink and parchment, not pickaxes. Your job demanded patience and precision. And although the average citizen might never know your name, generals and governors certainly valued your work. Quiet influence again, the kind that rarely sweats. Then there were shipbuilders and naval engineers. Not the sailors braving storms, but the designers and supervisors constructing the vessels. Rome's dominance of the Mediterranean, their so-called mare nostrum, relied heavily on maritime infrastructure. Building a ship required geometry, woodworking expertise, and coordination of labor. A master shipwright commanded respect. He understood balance, buoyancy, and durability. His workshop was noisy, yes, but it was also structured. He was the mind behind the vessel, not the body chained to an oar. And speaking of minds, astrologers and scholars held curious but comfortable niches. Romans were deeply interested in omens, celestial patterns, and predictions. Astrology, though not always universally respected, found enthusiastic audiences among elites. If you could interpret the stars convincingly, you could secure patronage from individuals who wanted reassurance that their political ambitions aligned with the cosmos. It was a peculiar career, but once again, it involved discussion rather than demolition, conversation rather than combat. We might also pause to appreciate the stability of religious officials within established cults and temples. Priests and priestesses maintained rituals, oversaw sacrifices, and organized festivals. In Rome, religion was woven into civic life. Public ceremonies were constant. Maintaining them required organization and consistency. Temple roles varied in prestige, but many offered regular duties within a defined structure. You managed schedules, maintained sacred objects, supervised attendance. Your work was repetitive, ceremonial, and largely indoors. Compared to frontier warfare, leading a procession was almost tranquil. Even in commerce, certain specialized traders achieved remarkable comfort. Wine merchants dealing in high-quality vintages, for instance, catered to affluent clients. Olive oil distributors managed products that were essential to daily life. If you positioned yourself within a supply chain that Rome could not live without, your relevance became durable. And durability, more than excitement, defined a good Roman job. There is something gently ironic about all this. The empire is remembered for spectacle, triumphal arches, roaring crowds, military parades, but the best lives were often built in the margins of spectacle, behind counters, inside workshops, at desks, under shaded porticos. A well-positioned professional in Rome might never achieve legendary fame. No marble bust would immortalize the accountant who balanced provincial budgets flawlessly for 20 years. No epic poem would celebrate the librarian who preserved scrolls with careful hands. But those individuals likely lived longer, calmer lives than many of Rome's so-called heroes. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all. In a civilization famous for its grand ambitions, the most desirable jobs were quiet ones, structured ones, roles that valued steadiness over glory. If you could wake up, perform your craft competently, avoid catastrophic political entanglements, and return home to bread and oil at the end of the day, you were doing extraordinarily well by ancient standards. So as the empire stretches out before you in your imagination, columns glowing faintly in the evening light, you might gently step away from the arena gates. You might choose instead the desk, the workshop, the temple ledger, the drafting table, and in doing so, you would have found one of the very best jobs ancient Rome had to offer. And yet, even after all of these respectable professions, we have not quite exhausted Rome's surprisingly comfortable corners. Because Rome, for all its thunderous imagery, was also an empire of habits. Habits require maintenance. Maintenance requires people. And some of those people, quite frankly, had it relatively good. Take, for example, the role of a professional tutor within a wealthy Roman household. Not just a teacher in a small schoolroom, but a live-in educator attached to a prominent family. You oversaw the education of children in literature, rhetoric, philosophy, and sometimes even basic politics. You dined in proximity to influence. You walked through colonnaded courtyards instead of muddy fields. Your life revolved around books and conversation. Certainly, you needed patience. Young Romans were not universally obedient, but your tools were scrolls, not shovels. And if your pupil grew into a successful magistrate, your own position became even more secure. Then there were imperial administrators working directly under the emperor's bureaucracy. As Rome transitioned from republic to empire, the scale of administration expanded dramatically. The emperor required secretaries, advisors, and managers to oversee provinces, finances, public works, and communications. These were not glamorous roles. They involved long hours of reading reports and drafting responses. But proximity to the imperial court meant stability, provided you navigated politics carefully. The work was structured, organized, focused on governance rather than physical endurance. Another quietly desirable profession was that of a professional copyist in major urban centers. Rome's appetite for literature, law, and philosophy meant that texts needed to be reproduced continuously. Skilled copyists worked carefully, line by line, ensuring accuracy. It required focus and literacy. It required steady hands. But it did not require standing guard in freezing northern provinces. A long day copying Virgil may have been monotonous. But monotony, compared to battlefield unpredictability, was a gift. Even within the entertainment sphere, there were levels of comfort. Scriptwriters, stage managers, and musicians supporting theatrical productions could operate behind the scenes. Rome loved spectacle, but spectacle relied on coordination. Someone had to rehearse performers. Someone had to arrange music. Someone had to keep track of props. These individuals were not in mortal danger. They were managing logistics. And as we have seen repeatedly, logistics was Rome's quiet superpower. We should also consider skilled negotiators and brokers operating in trade hubs like Ostia, Rome's port city. Goods from across the empire flowed through these channels. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, spices from the east. Brokers facilitated deals between merchants, smoothing disputes and arranging contracts. Their expertise lay in communication, in knowing market values, in understanding both supply and temperament. If you were persuasive and knowledgeable, you could build a career based on conversation rather than construction. Even positions within large construction projects had layers. While unskilled laborers carried stone, project supervisors coordinated teams, managed timelines, and oversaw quality. These foremen occupied a middle tier, responsible but not physically crushed by the work. Again, competence translated into insulation. What becomes increasingly clear is that ancient Rome, much like modern societies, offered ladders. Not everyone could climb them. Circumstance, birth, and opportunity played enormous roles. But skill, particularly intellectual or administrative skill, created space above the harshest forms of labor. The empire required minds as much as muscles. Roads needed planning. Laws needed drafting. Trade needed organizing. Knowledge needed preserving. And so, when imagining the best jobs in ancient Rome, we are not searching for luxury in the modern sense. We are searching for safety, predictability, respectability. A role where your greatest daily challenge involved solving a problem rather than surviving one. You might not have worn a laurel wreath, you might never have stood before cheering crowds, but you could have lived steadily, productively, perhaps even comfortably, by ancient standards. In a civilization that built amphitheaters for spectacle, the true victories often happened in quiet rooms filled with scrolls, tools, and ledgers. And if you were wise enough, or lucky enough, to secure one of those rooms, ancient Rome might not have been such a terrible place to earn a living after all. Now, if we move gently toward the edges of the empire, not the dramatic edges with marching legions, but the administrative edges, we find yet more roles that were, by Roman standards, remarkably tolerable. Consider the provincial governor's staff, not the governor himself, who carried immense political risk, but the advisors, clerks, and assistants who supported him. Provinces required taxation systems, infrastructure oversight, judicial hearings, and communication with Rome. That meant paperwork, endless, steady paperwork. Serving on a provincial staff often meant travel to a new region, yes, but once there, your responsibilities were structured. You handled correspondence, recorded rulings, and organized public accounts. You lived within administrative compounds rather than barracks. Your days were measured in reports, not in battles. And then there were professional engineers attached specifically to aqueduct construction. Roman aqueducts were feats of technical brilliance. They carried water across valleys, over hills, and into cities with astonishing precision. Maintaining them required inspectors and specialists who understood gradient and flow. An aqueduct inspector walked along stone channels, checking for blockages or cracks. It was quiet work, methodical work. You dealt with water pressure rather than political pressure, and in a society that valued clean water immensely, your expertise was secure. Even roles within urban planning offered a form of calm predictability. City officials oversaw sanitation, road maintenance, and public building upkeep. Rome was crowded, yes, but it was also organized. Someone had to schedule repairs. Someone had to coordinate labor crews. These supervisors were administrators more than laborers. Their job was to think ahead, not to carry bricks. We might also acknowledge the surprising comfort of certain commercial warehouse managers in port cities like Ostia. Massive shipments of grain and goods required storage and inventory control. A warehouse manager ensured proper accounting, rotation of goods, and security. You worked indoors, among stacks of amphorae. Your concerns involved spoilage rates and delivery schedules. Compared to sea voyages or agricultural toil, this was structured commerce at its calmest. There was also a place in Roman society for professional trainers, those who educated animals for practical or entertainment purposes. Not gladiator trainers, but trainers of horses for chariots or cavalry. Skilled horse trainers commanded respect. They understood temperament and conditioning. Yes, the work required patience and physical awareness. But it was expertise-driven. You were valued for knowledge. You shaped performance without necessarily risking your own safety in the arena. Even within the massive Roman household economy, chefs in elite homes occupied relatively comfortable positions. Roman cuisine could be elaborate among the wealthy. Skilled cooks developed reputations. They experimented with spices, sauces, and presentation. A chef's environment was hot, certainly, but structured, predictable, and if attached to a stable household, your livelihood was secure. You were not foraging for survival. You were creating meals from abundant supplies. The more we explore, the more we notice that ancient Rome was not divided simply between rulers and laborers. There were layers, gradations, spaces in between where expertise offered protection, and protection from arbitrary violence, starvation, or exhaustion, was the true currency of a good job. Perhaps the most telling detail is this: Rome's expansion depended not just on soldiers, but on administrators, planners, negotiators, and craftsmen. Without them, the empire would have collapsed under its own weight. The spectacle of conquest was loud, but the maintenance of empire was quiet, and the quiet jobs were often the best ones. If you could wake up to a defined role, perform specialized tasks, earn predictable income, and avoid catastrophic political entanglements, you had achieved something rare in the ancient world. You were not merely surviving Rome, you were functioning within it, comfortably enough to rest at night without wondering whether tomorrow involved a battlefield. And in ancient Rome, that was already a kind of luxury. And as we continue this slow stroll through Rome's occupational landscape, it becomes almost soothing to realize how much of the empire relied on people who simply kept things running. Take the role of a professional mill operator. Now, grinding grain may not sound glamorous, and it certainly was not. But large urban mills, especially those supplying bread for Rome's population, were stable enterprises. Some were even powered by watermills in later periods, reducing the need for constant manual labor. If you supervised milling operations rather than pushing the grindstone yourself, your role was managerial. You monitored output, maintained equipment, and coordinated distribution. Bread was politically sensitive in Rome. The grain dole kept citizens calm, and that meant milling infrastructure was protected and prioritized. Being part of that system offered a kind of indirect security. No one wanted to disrupt the bread supply, so your job, while dusty, was unlikely to vanish overnight. Then there were metal workers specializing in tools and everyday goods rather than weapons. While blacksmithing often conjures images of swords and armor, much of Roman metalwork involved practical items: nails, hinges, farming implements, cookware. A skilled metalworker with a steady client base could operate a workshop that served local needs consistently. There was demand, there was repeat business. And unlike soldiers, you were not required to personally test your products in battle. We might also consider the role of a professional mediator. Disputes in Rome were common, over land, trade agreements, inheritance. While formal courts existed, many conflicts were settled through negotiation. If you had a reputation for fairness and clarity, you could act as an intermediary. Your work required diplomacy, listening, and careful wording. But it kept you indoors. It kept you away from the physical consequences of unresolved conflict. In a society that valued social order, mediation was a practical and respected function. Even scribes attached to military units enjoyed a different experience from frontline soldiers. They documented supply inventories, recorded troop movements, and tracked payroll. They wore uniforms, yes, but their weapons were styluses. It is worth emphasizing how many of Rome's more comfortable roles centered on information, recording it, interpreting it, preserving it. The empire's scale demanded organization, and organization required literacy. Then there were physicians specializing in urban clinics rather than battlefield surgery, treating common ailments, setting bones, prescribing herbal remedies. This was steady, if occasionally challenging work. In densely populated cities, Demand was constant. A competent urban physician could build trust over time. Patients returned. Families recommended you. You became embedded in the community's daily rhythms rather than its crises. We should not overlook the surprisingly stable position of auctioneers and estate managers handling property sales. Rome's elite frequently bought and sold land, villas, and urban houses. Someone had to assess value, arrange transactions, and document transfers. It was administrative commerce at its calmest. No physical strain, just negotiation and paperwork. Even craftsmen specializing in mosaic floors for wealthy homes operated in a steady niche. Roman elites adored decorative artistry. Once you established skill in geometric patterns or mythological scenes, commissions could be regular. You worked in villas, not fields. You created beauty rather than enduring hardship. The more we examine, the more ancient Rome resembles an intricate machine, loud at the surface, spectacular in its conquests, but underneath, powered by individuals who mastered steady professions. The best jobs were not about escaping work. They were about escaping unpredictability, escaping brute force, escaping the fragility of day-to-day survival. If you could secure a position that relied on skill and consistency, you gained insulation. And insulation, in a pre-modern world, was everything. So, when imagining yourself walking through the Forum at sunset, sandals tapping softly against stone, you might pause, not to watch gladiators, but to sit at a wooden table, open a ledger, and do something profoundly unremarkable. And in ancient Rome, that might have been the most remarkable career choice of all. P10, and perhaps the most quietly enviable of all Roman professions, were those that existed just slightly outside the center of power, close enough to benefit from stability, far enough to avoid its dangers. Consider the role of a rural villa administrator working for an absent elite landowner. Many wealthy Romans owned vast estates, but preferred to spend most of their time in the city. That left trusted managers in charge of daily operations. These administrators oversaw planting schedules, supervised workers, balanced accounts, and ensured shipments of produce reached urban markets. It was responsibility-heavy work, yes, but it was structured. You lived in relative comfort compared to field laborers. You managed systems rather than digging soil yourself. Your greatest concern might be weather patterns or crop yields, not military invasions. Then there were artisans specializing in luxury goods, jewelers, fine cloth dyers, engravers. Rome's upper class had an appetite for refinement. Rings, brooches, decorative silverware, dyed fabrics in rare shades. If you mastered a niche skill, your clientele could be both wealthy and loyal. A jeweler's workshop was small but valuable. Precision mattered. Reputation mattered more. And once established, such a craft could sustain generations. It was not a noisy forum or a bloody arena. It was meticulous, careful work that rewarded patience. Another surprisingly steady profession was that of a public works inspector. Rome invested heavily in roads, baths, bridges, and aqueducts. Infrastructure required oversight. Inspectors ensured projects met standards and repairs were completed properly. Your work involved walking sites, reviewing progress, consulting plans. It required knowledge, not brute strength. You were part of Rome's long-term durability, rather than its short-term spectacle. Even in commerce, certain middle-tier merchants who focused on consistent essential goods lived relatively secure lives. Olive oil traders, grain brokers, fabric wholesalers. These were commodities woven into daily Roman life. You did not rely on trends or fashion. You relied on necessity. Necessity is a very comforting customer. There were also scribes and administrators attached to temples and religious institutions who handled donations, records of offerings, and festival planning. Religion in Rome was civic as much as spiritual. Maintaining temple accounts required organization and reliability. It was routine work, repetitive, predictable, and in a society deeply attached to ritual. Ritual created employment. And finally, perhaps the most subtle but powerful good job in ancient Rome was simply being educated and adaptable. Rome valued practical intelligence. If you could read, calculate, draft documents, negotiate, or supervise, you were not locked into a single exhausting path. You could move, adjust, climb incrementally. The empire was vast. Its economy was layered, and within those layers existed quiet pockets of professional comfort. None of these roles eliminated hardship entirely. Rome was not a gentle place. Disease existed. Politics were volatile. Social hierarchies were rigid. But within that world, the best jobs shared a few consistent traits. They were skill-based rather than strength-based. They offered predictable income. They involved organization rather than physical punishment. They allowed you to operate indoors more often than not. And perhaps most importantly, they kept you far from lions. So if you were somehow transported back 2,000 years and offered a choice, you might decline the sword and shield. You might choose instead the stylus, the ledger, the drafting compass, the workshop bench, the aqueduct inspection route. You would wake in the morning not to trumpet calls, but to the quiet rustle of parchment. And as the vast Roman Empire carried on around you, building roads, arguing in the Senate, staging elaborate spectacles, you would sit in your small, steady corner of it, earning a living, avoiding catastrophe, and by ancient standards, doing exceptionally well. And if we continue to peel back the marble facade of empire, what remains is something almost tenderly ordinary. Rome was, above all else, a machine that required maintenance, and maintenance rewards the patient. There were archivists who spent their days organizing public records, births, deaths, property transfers, census lists. Rome loved a census. It counted people with almost affectionate seriousness. Someone had to collect those names, file those tablets, preserve them for future reference. It was not heroic work. No triumphal arch commemorates a well-organized registry. But without records, taxation faltered. Military conscription faltered. Governance faltered. The archivist, quietly seated in a dim office stacked with documents, was more essential than he looked. Then there were water distribution supervisors in major cities. Once aqueducts delivered water to Rome, the supply had to be directed to baths, fountains, private homes, and public buildings. Officials, known as curatores aquarum, oversaw distribution and maintenance. Beneath them worked administrators who tracked flow allocations and repairs. Water, like bread, was politically sensitive. A steady water supply kept citizens calm and cities functional. Being part of that system offered stability. You were working with one of the empire's lifelines, and lifelines are rarely dismissed casually. We might also imagine the daily life of a Roman book dealer. Yes, Rome had them. Scrolls were bought and sold, copied and circulated. A bookseller managed inventory, connected customers with texts, and occasionally commissioned copies. It was a niche profession, certainly limited to literate clientele, But that clientele included senators, lawyers, teachers, and ambitious young men preparing speeches. Your shop would not be loud. It would not be physically demanding. It would smell faintly of parchment and ink. And in a civilization obsessed with rhetoric, your goods were always in demand. Even certain medical specialists, those who focused on specific treatments like bone setting or herbal remedies, could carve out reputations that secured regular income. Rome's dense urban population meant accidents were frequent. So were minor illnesses. A skilled practitioner who developed trust could remain busy without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Another quietly comfortable position existed in Rome's shipping administration. While sailors faced storms, administrators coordinated docking schedules, customs duties, and cargo documentation. Ports like Ostia were hubs of activity, but behind the noise were offices filled with clerks ensuring goods moved efficiently. Again, we see the pattern: information, organization, structure. There were also professional guardians and tutors appointed to oversee the estates of minors. If a wealthy Roman died leaving young heirs, trusted adults managed property until those heirs came of age. This required integrity and financial literacy. It required careful accounting and steady judgment. It did not require swinging a hammer. Even within Rome's complex legal system, there were consultants who specialized in advising families on inheritance law. Roman inheritance could be complicated: adoptions, wills, property divisions. If you understood those nuances, you were valuable. You helped families avoid costly disputes. You spent your time interpreting clauses rather than enduring labor. And then there were survey clerks attached to road construction projects. Rome's roads were legendary: straight, durable, extensive. Surveying and maintaining them required technical oversight. A clerk recorded distances, materials used, labor assignments. While others laid stone, you documented progress. It was not glamorous, but it kept you off your knees. As we move further through this landscape of professions, one realization becomes increasingly calm and persistent. The best Roman jobs were not defined by wealth alone. They were defined by predictability. Predictability in income. Predictability in daily routine. Predictability in physical safety. In a world where disease, famine, and war could disrupt life suddenly, having a role tied to the empire's administrative spine offered something rare: continuity. You might not control the fate of provinces, you might never appear in a history book, but you could live a life shaped by repetition rather than chaos. You would rise, walk familiar streets, sit at a familiar desk, greet familiar clients, and perform tasks that, while perhaps monotonous, were manageable. And perhaps monotony in ancient Rome was the greatest luxury of all. Because monotony meant survival. It meant the lions were elsewhere. It meant the legions marched without you. It meant the empire roared, and you simply kept the record straight. And in that quiet steadiness, you had found one of the very best jobs Rome could offer. And if we let the evening settle gently over Rome, columns cooling after the day's heat, market noise fading into distant murmurs, we begin to understand something almost comforting about this enormous civilization. It was not sustained by heroes. It was sustained by routines. There were keepers of public granaries who monitored storage levels and spoilage. Grain was everything. Without it, unrest followed quickly. A granary supervisor tracked shipments, inspected quality, and ensured rotation of stock. The work required vigilance, yes, but it was systematic. organized. You managed abundance rather than chased it, and in a city that feared hunger more than boredom, your position was protected. There were coin minters working under official oversight in state mints. While mining silver was brutal, minting coins required precision and supervision. You weighed metal, struck dies, inspected currency for flaws. Rome's economy depended on reliable coinage. A steady hand and attention to detail could secure a stable post within this carefully guarded system. Again, expertise created insulation. Even certain positions within Rome's educational ladder offered incremental comfort. Advanced rhetoric instructors who taught aspiring politicians could command respectable fees. Their classrooms were spaces of argument and analysis, not physical strain. Students debated philosophy, law, and governance while seated under shaded porticos. The teacher corrected phrasing, refined logic, and perhaps suppressed mild exasperation. But exasperation is not fatal. In Rome's vast trading networks, contract drafters ensured agreements between merchants were properly formalized. Long-distance commerce required trust reinforced by documentation. If you were skilled in drafting airtight agreements, you became indispensable to those moving goods across seas. Your work prevented disputes before they erupted. There were even professionals who specialized in timekeeping and calendar management. Rome's civic and religious life revolved around carefully structured calendars. Festival days, market days, legal deadlines. Adjustments to the calendar had political and economic implications. Those who understood its complexities played subtle but important roles. You dealt with dates and decrees rather than dangers. And what of private estate librarians in grand Roman villas? Wealthy families accumulated scrolls, poetry, philosophy, histories. Someone had to catalog and maintain these collections. It was quiet, indoor work surrounded by knowledge. Your daily concern might be humidity control rather than humidity in a battlefield swamp. Even the role of a professional messenger within urban centers offered predictable rhythm. Short-distance delivery between officials, merchants, and courts meant movement, but structured movement. Familiar routes, known destinations. You were part of the city's circulatory system, and unlike soldiers dispatched to distant frontiers, you returned home nightly. As we reach this point in our exploration, a pattern has crystallized fully. The best jobs in ancient Rome were rarely those that dazzled the imagination. They were those that minimized risk. They were embedded within systems that Rome could not afford to neglect: water supply, grain distribution, finance, law, education, infrastructure. If your role supported one of these pillars, your livelihood had a buffer against instability. Rome could replace soldiers. It struggled to function without administrators. Rome could recruit laborers. It depended on accountants to know where resources flowed. Rome celebrated generals, but it quietly relied on clerks. And so if you imagine yourself stepping softly through the forum one last time tonight, sandals brushing stone, you might feel the distant echo of speeches and crowds. But you would not join them. You would turn instead toward a modest doorway, a desk waiting inside, a stack of tablets neatly arranged. You would sit, you would record, you would balance accounts, draft contracts, inspect water flow, catalog scrolls. And while history remembered emperors and conquests, you would remember something simpler. You worked indoors, you slept safely, you lived steadily. And in ancient Rome, that may have been the best job of all. And even now, as the lamps are lit one by one across the city, we can still find a few more surprisingly comfortable corners of Roman working life. Because Rome, for all its noise and marble and military ambition, was also a place where expertise accumulated quietly. There were professional tutors for adults, yes, adults, who wished to refine their rhetoric or philosophical understanding later in life. Ambitious politicians often hired private instructors to sharpen their speeches before important debates. These tutors operated in calm, shaded rooms, reviewing arguments line by line. Their work was measured in syllables, not in scars, and syllables are generally safer. There were also estate auditors, individuals brought in specifically to review financial records of large agricultural or commercial enterprises. When a landowner suspected inefficiency or minor corruption, an auditor arrived. He examined ledgers, compared output to reported yield, asked careful questions. It required tact. It required numeracy. But it did not require swinging tools under the midday sun. And because wealth needed protection, auditors were periodically necessary. A discreet, competent auditor could move between estates steadily, building reputation. In urban centers, professional architects who specialized in renovations rather than monumental construction found steady work. Rome was old, even to Romans. Buildings required reinforcement, redesign, adaptation. A practical architect who could adjust structures without collapsing them was highly valued. It is one thing to build a temple from scratch. It is another to fix a cracked wall without causing panic. We might also consider the role of a master dyer in the textile trade. Certain dyes, particularly the famed Tyrian purple, were expensive and associated with status. Producing consistent color required skill and control. A master dyer supervised processes carefully, ensuring quality. It was technical craft, not brute labor, and once your product became associated with reliability, clients returned. Then there were librarians attached to temples or educational institutions who managed not just storage, but acquisition. They selected which texts to copy, which to preserve. They corresponded with scholars. They shaped quietly what knowledge endured. That kind of influence is subtle but durable. Even positions within Rome's legal bureaucracy, such as specialists in property registration, offered remarkable predictability. Rome's obsession with ownership meant property transfers were constant. A registrar verified boundaries, updated records, confirmed witnesses. You dealt with land disputes through documentation, not duels. And as trade networks matured, shipping insurance agreements began to appear in rudimentary forms. Merchants sometimes shared risk across ventures. Advisors who understood these arrangements could structure partnerships that minimized catastrophic loss. Risk management in ancient Rome, it sounds modern because, in many ways, it was. Another quiet profession existed in maintaining public clocks and sundials. Accurate timekeeping was essential for civic coordination. Market hours, court sessions, festivals, all depended on structured time. A specialist who calibrated these instruments ensured the city's rhythm remained intact. You worked with shadows and angles, not with swords. And perhaps most understated of all were professional secretaries who handled correspondence for wealthy women managing estates or businesses. Elite Roman women often oversaw substantial property. Trusted secretaries drafted letters, managed accounts, coordinated transactions. Their environment was domestic but influential. Their work was administrative and continuous. As we move deeper into this gentle catalog, something becomes almost serene. Rome's best jobs were not defined by comfort in the modern sense, no climate control, no ergonomic chairs, but they offered insulation from the harshest vulnerabilities of the era. They were repetitive, structured, skill-dependent. They relied on knowledge rather than muscle, and they anchored individuals within systems too important to collapse easily. If you secured such a role, you stepped slightly aside from the empire's most dangerous currents. You were not untouchable. No one in ancient Rome truly was, but you were buffered. So, as the night settles fully over the city and torches flicker along colonnades, you might imagine yourself returning home from a day of reviewing contracts or calibrating a sundial. No armor to remove, no wounds to dress, just ink-stained fingers and perhaps mild fatigue from concentrating too long on careful handwriting. And in the vast, unpredictable sweep of Roman history, that small, steady life may have been the greatest professional achievement available. And still the empire hums, not with the clang of swords or the roar of crowds, but with the soft, persistent murmur of people doing their jobs properly. There were urban property managers who oversaw apartment buildings in Rome's crowded districts. The city was filled with insulae, multi-story residential buildings housing much of the population. While tenants worried about rent and structural creaks, the property manager coordinated repairs, collected payments, and ensured basic maintenance. It was not glamorous, but it was managerial. You handled schedules and contractors rather than hauling bricks yourself. You negotiated disputes between neighbors rather than fighting wars between nations. In a city constantly expanding upward, your role remained necessary. Then there were professional legal scribes who specialized in drafting wills. Roman inheritance law could be astonishingly complex. Families navigated adoption rules, dowries, trusts, and guardianship clauses. A skilled will writer ensured property transferred smoothly across generations. Your days were spent discussing contingencies rather than enduring them. Even positions within Rome's vast military supply chain offered surprising comfort. Quartermasters responsible for provisioning legions operated from structured depots. They tracked grain, equipment, sandals, and weapons. They did not march into battle. They ensured others could. It required arithmetic, organization, and foresight. It required calm under bureaucratic pressure. But it did not require facing cavalry charges. We might also pause at the profession of surveyors attached to urban expansion projects. As cities grew, new districts were plotted carefully, streets aligned, plots measured, drainage considered. Surveyors applied geometry to prevent chaos. You stood with measuring rods and assistants, marking lines in dust. A quiet authority. The future shape of the city resting on angles and increments. There were even career auction managers who organized estate liquidations and property sales. When fortunes shifted, as they often did, someone coordinated the orderly redistribution of goods. Furniture, tools, land parcels. An auction required structure and clarity. You spoke loudly, perhaps, but you did so indoors, in a controlled environment, overseeing transactions rather than participating in dangerous ones. In Rome's educational sphere, manuscript correctors, individuals who reviewed copied texts for errors, performed meticulous work. One misplaced word in a legal document could create enormous problems. A careful corrector prevented those errors from multiplying. It demanded patience and literacy. It rewarded focus. And it kept you seated. Even certain religious administrative roles, such as temple treasurers, offered security. Temples accumulated donations, managed funds for festivals, and oversaw maintenance. A treasurer recorded offerings and expenditures carefully. Money, ritual, repetition. Three forces that rarely vanished overnight. And then there were long-established family businesses passed from parent to child. A small workshop producing oil lamps, a bakery known for consistency, a dye house with loyal customers. Inheriting such a business meant inheriting stability. Rome valued continuity. Continuity in family, continuity in property, continuity in profession. The more we examine this ancient world, the more it feels oddly familiar, not in technology, certainly, but in structure, in the way societies rely not just on spectacle, but on systems. The best jobs in ancient Rome were embedded in those systems. They were tied to essentials: water, food, law, education, infrastructure, trade. If you worked within an essential pillar, your position had gravity. And gravity, in uncertain times, is comforting. So as we move deeper into this gentle inventory of Roman professions, perhaps the most surprising realization is this: the ideal Roman job was not about luxury, it was about insulation from volatility. You did not seek applause, you sought predictability. A desk, a ledger, a measuring rod, a steady client list. And when the empire roared around you, celebrating triumphs, lamenting defeats, you remained in your quiet role, counting, recording, maintaining, and sleeping most nights without fear of lions. And as Rome ages, because even empires age, the value of steadiness becomes even clearer. Grand gestures fade, marble cracks. But routine endures. There were record keepers attached to the Census Bureau who updated population lists every few years. The census in Rome was not a casual survey. It determined taxation, military eligibility, and civic classification. Accuracy mattered. A census clerk verified names, ages, property declarations. You sat with tablets while citizens recited details about their households. You listened. You recorded. You double-checked. It was administrative repetition at its most orderly. No one applauded a correct census entry, but incorrect entries caused chaos. There were also municipal treasurers in smaller towns across the empire. Not every Roman lived in the capital. Provincial cities had their own councils, their own budgets. A town treasurer managed funds for repairs, festivals, and local administration. Your world was smaller, more predictable. You knew the people whose taxes you recorded. The pace was slower than Rome's urban rush. Stability scaled down becomes even more comfortable. Even certain craftsmen in the construction trade, those who specialized in finishing touches like plastering or decorative stone carving, operated in a quieter tier. The heavy lifting was done by others. You arrived when walls were standing. You refined surfaces, added details, perfected edges, skill over strain. We should not forget professional letter writers who set up in public spaces to assist illiterate citizens. Not everyone in Rome could write formal correspondence. If you were literate and articulate, you could sit at a small table and compose letters on behalf of others. You listened to stories of business disputes, family matters, petitions. Then you translated them into proper written Latin. It was social work in a way, structured, respectful, necessary, and it kept you under a canopy rather than under armor. There were also public notaries stationed near courts to authenticate documents and witness agreements. Their presence ensured transactions carried legal weight. They stamped, sealed, recorded, repetition again. Repetition is reliable. Even within Rome's immense road network, maintenance supervisors monitored wear and tear. Roads were Rome's arteries. Cracks, erosion, loose stones, all required inspection. A road supervisor walked stretches methodically, noting sections needing repair. It was outdoor work, yes, but not frantic, not violent. A long walk with a checklist, a manageable rhythm. In major ports, dock clerks tracked cargo entry and departure. They recorded shipments of grain, oil, marble, and textiles. They calculated duties, confirmed weights. While sailors faced storms, the dock clerk faced numbers. And numbers are calmer than waves. Even professional trainers who prepared young aristocrats in etiquette and public comportment found steady employment. Rome valued appearances deeply. How to stand, how to gesture, how to address a superior. If you mastered these codes, you could teach them. Your classroom was a courtyard. Your subject was posture. It required observation, not endurance. As we approach this quiet horizon of Roman careers, something becomes almost soothingly repetitive in our observations. The best Roman jobs were rarely heroic. They were infrastructural, administrative, educational, technical. They belonged to people who understood systems, and systems, once established, resist collapse more than individuals do. If you were woven into a system, grain supply, water distribution, legal documentation, trade logistics, you gained protection from the empire's most dramatic swings. So, as the lamps flicker low and the city settles, imagine yourself closing a ledger after a day of recording property transfers. Your tunic is clean. Your hands are ink-stained, not blistered. The lions are far away, and the empire, for all its noise, continues smoothly because of people exactly like you. That may not sound glamorous, but in ancient Rome it sounded very much like success. And by now, as the empire hums along in the background of our imagination, you may have noticed something quietly reassuring. The most desirable Roman jobs were not rare because they were magical. They were rare because they required preparation, education, apprenticeship, patronage, skill. These were not evenly distributed, but where they existed, they created space, small islands of relative calm within a vast and occasionally chaotic world. There were professional translators attached to provincial administrations who handled communication between Latin officials and local populations. Rome expanded over cultures that spoke dozens of languages. Orders, tax policies, and legal rulings had to be understood clearly. If you could bridge that gap, you were invaluable. You sat between worlds. You clarified misunderstandings before they became rebellions. It was intellectual labor. And intellectual labor, while tiring in its own way, did not usually involve blunt force. There were also professional contract negotiators who specialized in military supply agreements. Armies required food, clothing, animals, and equipment. These items did not appear spontaneously. Suppliers negotiated terms. Contracts were drafted. Payments scheduled. The negotiator ensured both sides remained satisfied enough to continue cooperation. You spent your day persuading rather than defending, and persuasion is quieter than battle. Even within the vast Roman bureaucracy, career clerks could rise incrementally. A junior scribe might begin copying minor documents. Over time, he might supervise others, manage archives, handle sensitive correspondence. Rome, like any system, rewarded familiarity. The more you understood its processes, the more difficult you became to replace. Familiarity is stability. There were estate survey inspectors who traveled occasionally but returned to familiar routes. They verified land boundaries, updated records, resolved disputes with geometry rather than anger. Their tools were rods and cords, not shields. Even professional artisans who specialized in maintaining public baths, repairing heating systems, monitoring furnace temperatures, operated within a predictable environment. Roman baths were engineering marvels. The hypocaust system required oversight. A specialist ensured warm floors remained warm. Your work supported leisure, and leisure in Rome was frequent. There were also professional speechwriters who crafted orations for senators and magistrates. Not every ambitious politician possessed natural eloquence. A skilled writer could structure arguments, refine phrasing, and embed persuasive rhythm. You shaped political outcomes from a desk, and no one threw spears at desks. In Rome's complex inheritance culture, guardianship advisors ensured minors' estates were protected legally. They interpreted laws, structured trusts, documented obligations, paperwork as protection, documentation as defense. Even tax assessment analysts, those who determined fair contributions based on land and income, occupied roles that were structured and consistent. Their calculations influenced public revenue, but their daily routine involved measuring acreage, reviewing records, and applying established formulas. Formulas are predictable. Predictability is comforting. And perhaps most understated of all were librarians in private scholarly circles who managed intellectual correspondence. Rome's educated elite exchanged letters discussing philosophy, politics, and literature. Someone organized those letters, filed them, preserved them. You curated conversation rather than endured confrontation. By now the pattern is almost hypnotic. The best Roman jobs were those that positioned you slightly behind the curtain, close enough to influence events, far enough to avoid physical consequence. You did not lead the parade. You ensured it began on time. You did not conquer provinces. You recorded their boundaries accurately. You did not address the Senate. You drafted the speech. And in a civilization that could swing from triumph to crisis quickly, that distance from volatility was priceless. So if you find yourself drifting toward sleep while imagining this immense ancient machine turning slowly in the lamplight, remember, somewhere in that city, 2,000 years ago, someone closed a ledger, stacked wax tablets neatly, and walked home through quiet streets. No armor clinking, no crowds roaring, just the soft satisfaction of having done something orderly. And in ancient Rome, that may have been the most luxurious career of all. And still, Rome continues, steady as stone, layered as sediment, built not only on conquest, but on habit. There were professional calendar advisors who helped officials determine the correct observance of festivals and legal days. The Roman calendar, especially before reforms, could be confusing. Intercalary months were inserted. Political considerations influenced timing. If you understood how to calculate and interpret the calendar properly, magistrates relied on you. You ensured courts opened on the right days. You prevented rituals from colliding awkwardly. You kept time itself orderly. That is a surprisingly peaceful responsibility. There were also public waymasters in marketplaces. Commerce depended on fairness, at least in theory. Official weights and measures were maintained and inspected. A weighmaster verified scales, checked compliance, and ensured that merchants did not quietly redefine the kilogram. It required attentiveness, authority, a calm presence. You enforced standards without lifting anything heavier than a bronze weight. Even within Rome's massive construction industry, logistics coordinators tracked material deliveries. Stone from one quarry, timber from another region, lime for mortar. Coordination prevented delay. A coordinator's power lay in foresight. He stood with lists in hand while others lifted blocks. Lists are lighter than blocks. There were professional estate correspondents who managed written communication between rural properties and urban owners. Reports of harvest yields, maintenance needs, tenant issues all flowed through structured letters. You translated rural realities into concise updates. Your office might overlook gardens rather than trenches. Even legal commentators, scholars who interpreted evolving Roman law, occupied comfortable intellectual territory. They wrote treatises explaining statutes, clarifying precedents. Students and advocates studied their work. Your legacy might be footnotes rather than monuments, but footnotes endure quietly. There were specialists who maintained public fountains and monitored water pressure in urban neighborhoods. Rome's citizens depended on accessible water. Inspecting fountains involved listening for irregular flow, checking for blockages, scheduling repairs, a steady walk, a checklist, a city functioning because you noticed a crack early. Even positions in Roman banking houses for account verifiers offered insulation. Before loans were issued or transactions finalized, someone reviewed records for errors. You double-checked columns of figures, confirmed balances. Caution is rarely dramatic, but it prevents drama. There were household education coordinators who arranged tutors, monitored progress, and structured curricula for elite families. You organized knowledge, managed schedules, ensured continuity again. It appears everywhere, and perhaps that is the final gentle thread running through all these professions. The best jobs in ancient Rome were not about wealth alone. They were about continuity. They connected to systems that Rome needed every single day: water, food, law, trade, time, education. If your labor was daily rather than occasional, essential rather than ceremonial, you gained stability. Rome could survive without a festival. It could not survive without bread. It could survive without applause. It could not survive without records. So, if you had positioned yourself within the quiet mechanics of empire, your life might have been repetitive, yes, occasionally tedious, perhaps mildly frustrating, but repetition meant tomorrow looked like today. And in the ancient world, that predictability was a luxury beyond gold. As the torches dim and the forum empties, imagine closing a scroll, tying it neatly with cord, and stepping into the evening air. The empire stands. The aqueduct flows. The ledger balances. And you, unnoticed by history, have one of the best jobs Rome ever offered. Not because it was exciting, but because it was steady. And even now, as Rome settles into the quiet rhythm of night, there are still a few corners of professional calm worth lingering over. Because Rome did not merely conquer land, it administered it. And administration, as we've gently discovered, is where comfort quietly lives. There were imperial archivists who handled correspondence between the emperor and provincial governors. Reports flowed constantly on taxes, infrastructure, unrest, grain shipments. Someone had to catalog, summarize, and file these letters in an orderly fashion. You were close to power, but not exposed to it. Your job was to organize communication, not to deliver the orders personally. That distance mattered. There were also curators of public games, not gladiators, not performers, but the administrators who scheduled events, managed budgets, and oversaw logistics. Rome adored spectacle, but spectacle required planning. Seating arrangements, animal procurement, performer contracts. A curator's day involved coordination and paperwork, not wrestling lions. Even in the legal world, specialists in contract storage maintained secure archives of agreements between merchants and families. Fireproofing, organization, duplication, these were concerns. You managed parchment like treasure, because in Rome it was. There were also professional scribes who worked specifically for merchant guilds. Trade associations kept records of members, contributions, regulations. Guild scribes ensured continuity and accountability. The guild depended on accuracy. Accuracy depended on you. You were a quiet hinge in a large economic door. We might also imagine inspectors of public baths who ensured cleanliness and safety standards. Bathhouses were complex systems, heated floors, water circulation, drainage. Inspectors verified that everything functioned properly. A checklist, a nod, a note in a ledger, and the bath remained warm. There were tax policy advisors who interpreted changing imperial decrees and explained them to local officials. Rome's laws evolved. Someone had to translate imperial language into practical instruction. It required reading carefully, thinking slowly, writing clearly, and it kept you indoors. Even professional land registrars in rural provinces found themselves in steady work. As Rome parceled out conquered territories, land ownership required documentation. Boundaries were drawn, titles assigned, transfers recorded. Land does not disappear overnight, and neither does the need to record it. There were even public library custodians who ensured scrolls were copied before deterioration set in. Preservation required vigilance. You inspected edges, checked bindings, coordinated recopying. You were guarding knowledge rather than defending borders, and guarding knowledge is far less noisy. By now, the pattern is almost hypnotic in its calm repetition. The best jobs in ancient Rome were not the ones that glittered. They were the ones that endured. They existed in offices, workshops, archives, counting rooms, drafting tables. They required focus, patience, literacy, arithmetic, craftsmanship. They insulated you from the empire's volatility by embedding you in its infrastructure. And infrastructure does not crave applause. It craves maintenance. So, as you imagine the vast Roman world stretching out under starlight, roads running straight into darkness, aqueducts silhouetted against the sky, you might picture yourself not on a battlefield or in a Senate chamber, but at a wooden desk, a small oil lamp flickering, a stylus scratching softly against wax. You close the tablet. You tie the scroll. You step outside into a city that continues functioning smoothly, because thousands of people like you did unremarkable work remarkably well. And in a civilization that could be brutal, unpredictable, and loud, you found a role that was quiet, structured, steady, and by Roman standards, exceptionally good. And as we drift toward the later hours of Rome's long day, it becomes almost clear that the true luxury in the ancient world was not gold or silk. It was insulation. There were imperial road registrars who maintained official lists of routes, distances, and maintenance schedules. Rome's roads did not simply exist. They were cataloged, updated, monitored. A registrar tracked repairs, recorded milestones, ensured accuracy in documentation. You were not laying stone. You were confirming that it had been laid properly. There were census analysts who reviewed regional data after collection. Population counts influenced taxation and military quotas. Analysts verified totals, cross-checked figures, identified discrepancies. It was slow work, careful work, and the greatest danger was miscalculation, not invasion. Even professional estate planners existed in Rome, advisors who helped families structure property division before death. They anticipated disputes, drafted legal frameworks, minimized conflict. You prevented drama quietly. There were also professional instructors who specialized in accounting education. As commerce expanded, numeracy became increasingly valuable. Merchants wanted apprentices trained properly. An accounting instructor taught ledgers, tally methods, interest calculations. Your classroom may have been modest, but your skills shaped stability. Even in military contexts, strategic map archivists preserved campaign maps and logistical diagrams. While generals received glory, archivists ensured lessons were not lost. You stored memory, and memory is safer than combat. There were official seal makers responsible for producing standardized government seals. Authentication mattered deeply in Roman bureaucracy. A forged seal could cause chaos. A skilled engraver crafted precise impressions. It required artistry and trust, not armor. Even in provincial cities, civil record keepers updated marriage, birth, and property logs year after year. Generations passed. Tablets accumulated. Names were written, preserved, referenced. Your work outlived the individuals it described, and that is a quiet kind of power. There were supervisors of public granary transport who coordinated movement from storage to distribution points. They tracked shipments, confirmed quantities, scheduled deliveries. Bread reached citizens because you confirmed the numbers. There were professional correspondents who specialized in diplomatic exchanges between Rome and allied states. Letters required careful tone, politeness balanced with authority. These writers understood nuance. Nuance rarely draws swords. It prevents them. And so, as this long, steady catalog of professions stretches on, one gentle truth remains consistent. The best jobs in ancient Rome were those that reduced exposure to volatility. They lived inside systems too essential to collapse casually. They rewarded skill over spectacle, consistency over charisma, patience over power. If you found such a role, your life might not have been easy, but it was manageable, predictable, structured, and structure in the ancient world was a gift. So imagine yourself at the end of another Roman workday. The ledger balanced, the seal pressed cleanly into wax, the calendar aligned correctly with the festival schedule. You close your tools, you extinguish the lamp. Outside, the empire continues, roads stretching outward, ships docking in harbors, senators arguing beneath painted ceilings. But you are not at the center of that noise. You are in the quiet layer beneath it. And that quiet layer may have been the best place in ancient Rome to earn a living. And now, as the empire finally settles into the deep stillness of night, we can step back and look at the whole quiet machine we've been walking through. Ancient Rome is remembered for emperors, invasions, marble monuments, and dramatic speeches that echoed across the forum. History textbooks prefer spectacle, they prefer noise, they prefer men on horseback pointing confidently at maps. But empires do not run on pointing, they run on paperwork. They run on ledgers that balance correctly. They run on water flowing at the right gradient. They run on grain measured accurately, contracts worded carefully, roads inspected regularly, letters copied without error. And in that enormous, complicated system, the best jobs were the ones woven into those daily necessities. The scribe who copied laws, the accountant who tracked expenses, the surveyor who measured land calmly, the architect who checked the angle twice, the librarian who preserved scrolls, the negotiator who prevented a dispute before it became a crisis, the dock clerk who confirmed cargo weights, the temple treasurer who recorded offerings, the teacher who corrected a future senator's grammar. None of them stood in arenas. None of them marched at the front of legions. None of them had statues erected in their honor. But they likely lived longer, steadier lives than many of Rome's celebrated heroes. The best Roman job was not about luxury cushions or endless leisure. It was about insulation from chaos. It was about having a defined role inside a system that Rome could not afford to neglect. If you worked in water management, Rome needed you daily. If you worked in grain distribution, Rome needed you urgently. If you worked in law or finance, Rome needed you constantly. And being needed by something stable is, in many ways, the safest position a person could hold in the ancient world. Of course, no life in ancient Rome was entirely free from uncertainty. Disease could strike. Politics could shift. Fires could spread. Empires, as we know, eventually fracture. But within that vast and often volatile civilization, there were pockets of predictability. Rooms with desks, workshops with familiar tools, archives with neatly stacked tablets, courtyards where lessons were repeated each morning, and if you were fortunate or strategic enough to land one of those roles, your days would follow a rhythm. Wake, work, record, organize, return home, eat bread that someone else milled, sleep without armor, and perhaps that is the most quietly subversive truth of all. In ancient Rome, the best job was not the one that history remembered, it was the one that let you be forgotten. Because being forgotten often meant you were safe. You were not trampled by political storms. You were not shipped to distant frontiers. You were not fed to lions. You were simply part of the infrastructure, invisible, necessary, steady. And in a civilization built on conquest and ambition, that small, steady invisibility may have been the greatest professional achievement available. The empire roared. You balanced the books, and somehow that was more than enough.